Have you ever met someone who seemed to have it all? Money, power, respect, influence? People who, in the eyes of the world, were considered winners. But is all of that really enough to bring peace? Look, sunflowers, today I want to talk to you about a topic that, in my opinion, every human being should reflect on at least once in their life. There is a huge difference between escaping the consequences before men and being able to escape your own conscience. Many people believe that true justice only happens in courtrooms, in trials, or when someone is exposed publicly. But I've learned one thing throughout life. There are judgments that happen in the deepest silence. There are no witnesses, no audience, they don't appear in the newspapers, and often they are much harder to face because when conscience awakens, it asks questions that no one can silence. Today I want to tell a story. It doesn't matter what this man's name is, nor does it matter what era he lived in. What truly matters is what his choices taught us. For many years, he was considered one of the most powerful men in his region. He owned land, had influence, employees, and people who obeyed his orders without daring to question him. Whenever he arrived anywhere, everyone would lower their heads, some out of respect, but most out of fear. And there is a huge difference between being respected and being feared. Those who live surrounded by fear often believe they have control over everything until they discover there is something impossible to dominate, their own conscience. While his life was surrounded by wealth, he believed he could decide people's fates according to his own will. He treated human beings as if they were tools. He thought that feelings were a sign of weakness. He confused authority with violence, pride with greatness, and cruelty with a display of power. Each decision he made only fed his own ego even more. The more people bowed before him, the more he believed he would never have to answer for his own actions. But there is a very curious trait about life. It tends to give back what we sow, sometimes quickly, sometimes many years later, and in some cases, only when we are finally forced to look within ourselves. This man never imagined that the day would come when he would no longer have employees to obey him, no more money to protect him, no more prestige to hide his mistakes. There would come a moment when only he and the truth would remain. Because the truth has a very interesting trait. It can be ignored for a while, it can be hidden, it can be suppressed, but it rarely stays dormant forever. According to this account, when all the illusions built up over a lifetime disappeared, what began was something he never imagined he would have to face. It wasn't someone pointing out his mistakes, it wasn't a public condemnation, it was something much deeper. It was the moment when he began to see clearly every decision he had made, as if his entire existence were laid out before his own eyes, with no excuses, no justifications, and not enough pride to hide what he had truly become. And do you know what caught my attention most in this story? He didn't say he suffered because of a punishment imposed by someone else. The suffering was born from his own understanding. For the first time, he was able to feel the pain he had caused others. He realized the weight of every word spoken, every action taken, every opportunity missed to act with compassion. It's remarkable how life changes when we stop seeing only our own side. Maybe that's why so many people spend years trying to fill a void that no amount of money can fill, because there are wounds that aren't born in the pocket, but in the conscience. And the more we try to run from them, the more they follow us. Now, I want you to think with me. How many times, without realizing it, can we also harden our hearts? Maybe not through great acts of malice, but through indifference, arrogance, lack of forgiveness, words spoken on impulse, actions taken out of pride. It's very easy to point out the mistakes of those who lived centuries ago. What's really hard is to look inside ourselves and ask, am I building peace today, or am I accumulating regrets that one day might weigh on my own conscience? That question, sunflowers, is worth more than any judgment made by the world, because no one knows our story better than we do ourselves. No one can run forever from what they carry inside themselves. For a long time, that man believed he had won. People grew old, some passed away, others disappeared from his life. The marks he left behind seemed to have been forgotten by time, but they only seemed so because there is a big difference between forgetting and erasing. Time can silence many stories, it can hide events, it can make witnesses disappear, but the conscience records absolutely everything. It doesn't miss details, it doesn't accept bribes, it doesn't make deals, it just waits for the moment when we are ready to see what we once refused to see. According to his own account, that is exactly what happened. For the first time, he stopped focusing only on his own pain and began to see the pain of those who had crossed his path. It was as if every person who had once been ignored finally found their voice. He began to notice tears he had never seen before. He heard cries for help that he used to disregard. He remembered faces he had never bothered to memorize. And what shook him the most was not reliving those moments, but realizing that everything could have been different. All it took was a decision. A single decision made with compassion, but pride always spoke louder. And pride has a dangerous trait. It convinces a person that they are never wrong. It makes you believe that apologizing is a sign of weakness, that admitting a mistake diminishes your authority, when in fact, the exact opposite is true. Admitting a mistake requires a courage that few people possess. From that moment on, that man realized something he had never understood while surrounded by power. Every choice produces a consequence. Some bring joy, others bring pain. And there are choices whose consequences last much longer than we imagine. He says that he tried to find justifications. He told himself that he was just doing what everyone else did at that time, that this was how the world worked, that he was following the customs of his era. But none of these explanations brought relief, because when the truth stands before us, excuses completely lose their power. It was then that a question was born, one that began to follow him relentlessly. Who would I have been if I had chosen to act differently? Notice how this question changes everything. It doesn't talk about wealth, it doesn't talk about success, it doesn't talk about fame. It speaks about character, about wasted opportunities, about the good that could have been done but never was. And perhaps this is one of the greatest lessons of this story. We tend to imagine that major events transform a life, but often it is the small decisions repeated every day that shape who we truly become. A gesture of respect, a word of encouragement, a sincere apology, forgiveness granted at the right moment. All of this may seem small when it happens, but it can completely change the fate of two people. As he reflected on his own journey, that man realized he had spent years trying to control the world around him. He controlled people, controlled situations, controlled resources. There was only one thing he never learned to control: his own heart. And that is precisely where one of the greatest challenges of existence lies, because it is much easier to achieve important positions than to overcome the pride that lives within us. It is much easier to convince others that we are right than to admit our own mistakes. It is much easier to demand forgiveness than to learn how to forgive. At that moment in the story, one thing became very clear to me. True repentance is not born out of fear of punishment. It is born when we finally manage to feel the impact of our choices on the lives of other people. It is at this moment that a person truly begins to transform, because no one changes just by listening to advice. True change happens when consciousness awakens. And when it awakens, it is hard for us to see the world the same way again. Perhaps that is exactly why so many people carry a burden that money, recognition, or success can never relieve. They try to move on, try to keep their minds busy, try to convince themselves that the past is behind them. But what has not yet been reconciled in the heart continues to demand attention. And perhaps you are hearing this message precisely because there is some situation in your own life that still needs to be looked at with more honesty. Not to feed guilt, but to make room for true transformation. Because every change begins when we have the courage to recognize who we have been and decide who we want to be from now on. As he reflected on everything he had built throughout his life, that man began to realize a truth he had never understood when he was surrounded by wealth and authority. No pain disappears just because time has passed. Time changes people, changes places, changes circumstances, but there are marks that remain alive until they are truly understood. For a long time, he believed that the greatest suffering would be remembering his own choices, but it wasn't. What hurt him the most was realizing that many of the people who had crossed his path also remained trapped in memories of the past. Some carried deep resentments. Others were never able to understand why they had been treated so harshly. Others went on with their lives trying to rebuild what had once been destroyed. It was then that he realized something he had never imagined. Evil never ends only with the one who commits it. It usually keeps moving forward through those who have been hurt. A wounded person can end up hurting someone else. A cruel word leads to another cruel word. An injustice feeds another injustice. A life marked by hatred can, without realizing it, spread that same feeling for many years. It's like a stone thrown into a lake. The impact happens at a single point, but the ripples keep spreading far beyond that moment. It was at that moment that a desire was born within him that he had never felt before. It wasn't about having money again. It wasn't about regaining lost prestige. It wasn't about being admired once more. It was simply about finding a way to break that cycle of suffering. But there was a problem. He understood that some wounds were too deep to be erased with a simple apology. There are pains that take time to heal. There are people who first need to rebuild their own peace before they can look at those who hurt them. And understanding this was also part of the lesson, because throughout his life, he had demanded that everything happen at the moment he wished. Now he was learning that not even remorse can dictate its own timing. Every heart has its own rhythm. Every person faces battles that no one else knows about. It was then that he realized something that may be one of the greatest lessons of this story. Forgiveness was never meant to say that the wrong never happened. Nor does it mean forgetting, much less pretending that nothing happened. True forgiveness is born when someone decides not to let pain continue to rule their own life. It's like letting go of a weight that has been carried for years. Not because the other person deserves it, but because the one carrying that weight deserves to breathe in peace again. As he meditated on this, he began to understand that so often we spend our lives waiting for changes to come from the outside. We wait for someone to acknowledge their mistake. We wait to receive an apology. We wait for justice to happen exactly the way we imagine it. And while we wait, we keep postponing our own peace. How many people live like this, trapped by events that have already passed, reliving every day an old conversation, a betrayal, a humiliation, an abandonment, an injustice, as if memory were constantly dragging these wounds into the present. Look, sunflowers, there is a huge difference between remembering a pain and continuing to live inside it. The memory may remain, it is part of our story, but staying imprisoned by suffering is a choice we often make without realizing it. When that happens, life stops moving forward. The days go by, the years go by, but the heart remains stuck exactly at the moment it was hurt. And no one deserves to live that way. Neither those who made mistakes nor those who suffered. It was at that moment that the man understood that his greatest wish was no longer to erase the past. He knew that was impossible. What he truly wished for was that somehow the people who had once crossed his path would find peace. Because only when each heart finds peace does the cycle of pain truly begin to lose its strength. And perhaps it is precisely here that this story stops being just about him and starts being about each one of us. Because all of us, without exception, have hurt someone before. And all of us at some point in life have also been hurt. The big question is not who made more mistakes. The real question is, what are we going to do with what we carry in our hearts from this day forward? After understanding everything he had built along his own journey, that man stopped asking a question that had accompanied him for so long. For years he would ask, how can I erase what I have done? Until he realized that some pages of life cannot be torn out. They remain written, they are part of our story, but that doesn't mean they have to define who we will be forever. It was at that moment that he began to understand that there is a huge difference between living imprisoned by guilt and taking responsibility for one's own choices. Guilt paralyzes. It makes a person believe that nothing else can be done. Responsibility, on the other hand, awakens. It invites us to rebuild, to repair, to learn, to follow a different path from the one we once chose. Maybe that's why so many people confuse regret with transformation. Not every regret changes a life, but every true transformation is born when regret is accompanied by a sincere decision to never again feed what led us away from what is good. And this decision begins within each one of us. Look, sunflowers, while I was preparing this reflection, a question kept echoing in my heart. How many times do we wait for big signs to change our lives, when, in reality, transformation begins with the small actions of everyday life? It starts when we choose to respond with serenity instead of aggression, when we decide to listen before judging, when we set aside our pride to acknowledge a mistake, when we offer understanding where before there was only resentment. It is in these small choices that a new path begins to be built, because no one changes all at once. Change happens step by step, choice by choice, day by day. Many people believe that freedom means being able to do whatever they want, but there is a much greater freedom than that. It is the freedom of no longer carrying the weight of resentment. It is the freedom of not allowing the mistakes of the past to keep determining all the decisions of the present. It is the freedom to look back, acknowledge what needs to be acknowledged, and keep moving forward with greater awareness. Maybe today there is someone listening to this message who is waiting for an apology that will never come. Maybe there is someone who still carries an old hurt. Maybe there is someone who silently still hasn't been able to forgive themselves. If this is your case, I want to leave you with a thought. Don't let an old pain keep writing the next chapters of your story. The past teaches, the past strengthens, the past reveals who we were, but it doesn't have to decide who we can still become. Life always offers an opportunity to build a different path. It won't always be easy, it won't always be quick, but every small step toward peace already represents a great victory. And do you know what is the greatest wealth a human being can achieve? It's not recognition, it's not money, it's not power. It's laying your head on the pillow and feeling that, despite your own challenges, you are moving toward a more peaceful conscience. Because when there is peace in your heart, the world around you also starts to be seen in a different way. So I leave you with a question to reflect on with great care. Is there someone you still haven't been able to forgive? Or could it be that the person who most needs your forgiveness is actually the one who appears every day when you look in the mirror? Think about it. If this message spoke to your heart, share this video with someone who might also need to hear these words. And tell me here in the comments, what is the greatest lesson life has taught you about forgiveness? I will read many of your comments because every story shared here can help someone else find a new path. May peace accompany your steps, may wisdom illuminate your choices, and may you never lack the courage to start over whenever life offers a new opportunity. A big hug, sunflowers. Until our next meeting.